Alright, let's talk about how the game functions. So for the managing of the different play states, we have the attractor scene, which starts the attractor mode. It will initialize the game master and begin idle play, as well as creating a controller. This controller talks with the game master to mute the sound, as well as checking keybinds to see when we need to start one player mode or two player mode. The game master is built as a singleton, so it has a single pointer instance to it. If the pointer instance does not exist, it creates a new one and also populates it. If it does exist, it returns the pointer instance. This populating is responsible for taking all of the managers in the game that do not get deleted and puts it all in the game master so that it can be passed around as appropriate. It also gets the high score from the high score manager, as well as opens the wave file for the wave manager. In beginning the idle play, we go to the text manager to begin idle play. We get whatever was the last round. For the start of the game, it's 0, but after 1 or 2 player mode, the number changes. And we tell the HUD that that's how many texts to read from. So in the beginning of the game, no scores are displayed besides the highest score on the top row. After a game mode of 1 player, only the player 1 and the highest score will be shown up on the top row, and 2 players shows all those scores. For the play, next up for the and then after it begins idle play, because we're beginning idle play, it also receives the high scores. Receiving the high scores will tell the HUD what to print out, which I will cover when we talk about the managers a bit more in depth. For the grid manager, we change its state to be the idle state, so this will empty out the grid, and then so that we can repopulate it later. So it empties the grid, blocks the top row, sets the current grid, and then we move on. For the player manager, we begin idle play here. So beginning idle play is creating a blaster from the factory, updating the blaster in the controls, populating the controls since all of the keybinds use teal operations, so they're all game objects. Since it's the input mode, we reset the AI, so it sets its score to be the highest score, whatever's in the center, and it changes the bindings to the attractor mode bindings. Once we do that, then we get whatever the current active grid is, which is the grid 0, the idle grid. With the idle grid, we insert blockers. So this will get the scores from the high score manager, as well as the initials, and the press 1 or 2 to start a sentence from the high score list. And it will insert a text blocker entity at their position. This blocker entity behaves similar to the mushroom, but it cannot be destroyed by the bullets, and it cannot be poisoned, so the centipede always just sees it as a regular mushroom. After that, we activate the grid, which means we take the current player and get the board state from that player, which we will cover with the players. We will load the spawners, send the wave manager data, create the centipede, check for flee. If 1 or 2, when the key 1 or key 2 is pressed to start the level, then we will begin either 1 player, 2 player based on that number, and then we will also do the level, create a level controller. So this controller is essentially the game clock. It is within the scene specifically. It will process sounds as well as scores every update, every frame. It gets the sound manager and score manager from the game manager. It has to clear the queues and unmute it, because in the attractor mode we have because the sound manager still exists, we are still accruing sounds. So this just clears it out to make sure there are no excess sounds from the attractor mode. And then if M is ever pressed, then we change the state to mute the sounds. In beginning 1 player, 2 player, the functions are similar. So for score manager, we clear scores. We make sure that the attractor mode didn't accrue any points. Beginning 1 player, 2 player is similar. So beginning 1 player, we create the next blaster. We update the controls to have the new blaster and populate it with the keybinds. We reset player 1, so any leftover values from the last play state, we reset it to be 0. Get the current player and get the player 1 bindings. Player 2 does the same thing, except now we just add in resetting player 2, and now there are 2 players instead of 1. For the change state for the grid, just like with the player manager, we focus on grid 1. We empty the grid, set it to be the current grid, block the top row, and activate it. 2 grids, same thing as 1 grid, except now we focus on grid 2 as well as grid 1. Text manager, once again, we focus on resetting player 1's text. In 2 player, we focus on resetting player 1 and player 2's text. We load the spawners because they're game objects. We send in the wave data, create the centipede, create the flea, clear out the sound manager, and unmute the spawners. And that is how the game is managed.